Okay, I think we've had the green light to go ahead. Good afternoon to those of you in the UK, and good evening to Kate over in Sydney, Australia, and welcome to the first Fresh Minds webinar of 2021, a series we started about this time last year, so really great to get back on with a few interesting topics of discussion. So today we're delighted to be looking to tackle the subject of diversity, and clearly a big issue for what was probably historically the kind of concern of HR departments, and just in the last sort of 5-6 years become increasingly a massive issue for those in boardrooms and obviously investors as well. And we are super lucky to have a great friend of Fresh Minds, Kate Glazebrook, who is actually in Australia. I wasn't joking, but she is going to be sharing some thoughts about some learnings that she's picked up over the years in the world of diversity and building a business all around that area. And we're very lucky to have her on board. In terms of just giving you a quick intro to Kate and our connection with her, we met Kate through Nesta about 6 years ago. She was a bright entrepreneur looking to launch a recruitment platform, hoping to reduce bias from the recruitment processes. And that sort of seed of an idea became Applied, which has been a hugely successful, well-funded tech startup in the UK ecosystem working around the world. But before Kate became an entrepreneur, she was a principal at the Behavioural Insights team in London, otherwise known as the Nudge Unit, driving growth and equality there. And previous to that, worked for UNESCO and also the Treasury out in Australia. Without further ado, I'll just quickly introduce our plan of attack. So first up, I think Kate's going to share some slides and some thinking that she's gained over the years. And then after that, there'll be some time for some questions. Please just drop them into the chat box below, and I will try to moderate and share those questions to ensure we get the most out of this discussion. I think given Fresh Minds' focus as a business is in placing super smart consultants into permanent and interim jobs in consulting, industry, and the investment world, I think one of the lenses we were quite keen to understand a little bit more is practical tips ultimately for building recruiting into these businesses and ensuring they are capturing a much wider, diverse selection of smart talent to help them grow and prosper in the coming years ahead. So without further ado, a warm virtual welcome to Kate.
Thank you, James. And it's such a pleasure to be with you, even though, as James says, it's a slightly different hour over here in Sydney. So please bear with me if I'm not looking at my best. It's such a pleasure to be talking with all of you. And thank you for those of you in the UK who are spending a bit of a part of your day, particularly now that you have more freedoms than you did about a month ago, to sit with us and chat a bit about diversity, equity and inclusion, and the ways in which we can start to sort of build that into our hiring practices and our organisational practices. So I guess, as James said, I got some slides, but I promise you it won't be death by PowerPoint. If it is, then I've definitely not done what I've set out to do. And hopefully what we'll have an opportunity to do is James will sort of lead a conversation, and it's really my strong belief that the kind of most useful things that come out of these webinars really lie in the questions and answers and the conversation we can generate. So please bring a lot to that part of the session, but also I'm a pretty informal person, not only because I'm Australian, so feel free to interject at any point if you've got a question or you think you'd like to sort of raise something as we go through. So as James said, though you could take what he says and sort of apply a 20% discount, it's far too generous, but as he said, I was very lucky to meet James and Adam about 6 years ago when we were in the very early stages of building Applied. And I think it's pretty fair to say we were pretty green when he started doing that work. The thing that really drove our team was this idea of how do we apply behavioural science to reduce the risk of bias in the decisions we take about who we choose to work with. But we were new to the recruitment market. We knew a lot about the research, but we were new to the recruitment market, and we've certainly benefited from the wisdom and sort of direction of James and Adam and the whole Fresh Minds team over the last couple of years, and being very lucky to work in kind of quite close concert with them as we've sort of developed the product. So really looking forward to sharing with you a bit about what we've done at Applied. And what I thought I'd do is sort of lead off with the sort of worst kind of idea in the world, which is trying to encapsulate a couple of key aspects of behavioral science in just a couple of slides. Then lead you into sort of the problem statement. What was it that we were trying to solve and why? And I know a lot of this will be quite familiar to this group, but I thought it was important that we sort of frame the question in the right kind of way so that you know why it is that we've approached building a product around this the way that we have. And I'll share with you some of the sort of secret sauce and the thinking that's gone into the Applied platform. And then I'll move into sharing with you some specific research that I put together at the end of or middle of last year, specifically on the kind of impact that a redesigned hiring process can have on a STEM workforce. And in particular on the kinds of workforces I think that a lot of you are spending a lot of your time trying to hire into. And then of course we'll have as much time as we possibly can at the end to questions, comments, and everything in between. So I'm going to get started very quickly and just sort of lead in with what it is that our mission at Applied is about. Our kind of mission statement is pretty simple, actually. We just want to help you find the best person for every job, regardless of their background. And the three kinds of pillars, I guess you could call them, of the sorts of stuff we solve for are not only diversity, but also quality and efficiency as we go through. And you'll see that in a world where most applicant tracking systems and a lot of HR systems have been heavily focused on this efficiency question, we feel like there's an opportunity to also solve for diversity and equality at the same time. So I promised that I would start off with a kind of very blunt unconscious bias 101 with just two sort of lead-in examples. But before I do that, I guess it's probably worth starting out with a very, very, very simplified model of what unconscious bias and a model for thinking about how behavioral science sort of shapes the way that we think. So many of you are probably familiar with this concept that was popularized by a man called Danny Kahneman. He wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And he sort of popularized this idea that our brains operate in sort of two speeds almost simultaneously, that we have our system one brain. This is our sort of fast and intuitive part of our brain. It's the part of the brain that takes almost no energy, in fact, very, very few kilojoules to actually make decisions. And we use a lot of mental shortcuts to kind of make decisions in this part of our brain. It's sort of estimated that somewhere between 9,000 and 14,000 decisions are made by the brain in this part of our brain every single day. If that feels overwhelming, it's because it is, and you're not aware of most of them. That's kind of the point of this very efficient decision-making part of the brain. At the same time, we also have what's sort of referred to as system two, and this is our sort of slow thinking. It's conscious, it's deliberative. It's sort of the part of the brain that we use less frequently, but for more important decisions. Typically is the part of the brain that requires bringing multiple pieces of information, holding them simultaneously, trying to solve for a couple of separate things all at once, or it could be as simple as the difference between doing a 2 times 2 or a 371 times 13 calculation. The system two part of our brain is the sort of deliberate, slow thinking part of our brain. And I guess what behavioral scientists in general are really interested in is which kinds of decisions get triaged into system one or system two. Now, it's worth sort of saying kind of upfront that typically when people think about these concepts of system one and system two, it's very easy to inadvertently demonize system one and think that system two is the one that kind of saves us. But it's important to sort of say at the outset that, as I said earlier, like 9,000, 14,000 decisions get taken by the brain every day. Most of them have to be, by definition, taken by our system one brain. Now, the thing that's interesting to behavioral scientists is times when we inadvertently triage something into system one when it should really be a system two decision, or the reverse, and the ways in which those kinds of misfires sometimes lead us down the wrong path. So to sort of, I guess, bring some of that to life, I thought I'd also share with you a little bit of the history of how behavioral science has sort of evolved over the last sort of 80 to 100 years, which is really the sort of period of time where social psychology and sort of behavioral economics has really come into its own. So in sort of the 20s and 30s, I guess a lot of behavioral science was focused on these kinds of riddles. And in fact, a lot of them were focused on our sort of physiological responses to stimuli that we see in our everyday lives. So a kind of riddle that often depicts the ways in which the brain occasionally accidentally misfires is shown in this particular illustration. So unfortunately, I can't see all of your faces, so I'm going to have to trust that you're actually paying attention to this one. But essentially what this riddle is looking to do is, I'd like you to each think about which of the two tiles that I'm showing here on this screen, one is labeled A and one is labeled B, which of those tiles is darker? So hopefully it's relatively straightforward to kind of identify in your own mind which of those tiles is the darker of the two. But what if I were to remove some distractions for you? So I'm just going to take away a few pieces of information which stand between those two tiles. And I think for most of us, and of course I haven't tested this with all types of site, but for most of us will identify, once I've removed those particular contextual factors and those distractions, you'll see that actually tiles A and B are exactly the same hue. But when I remove those distractions, again, it looks like tile A is much darker than tile B. So I guess what is happening here? What is actually happening is that the brain is doing a pretty complex calculation at the moment. I've got this green cylinder here, which is casting a shadow, and that shadow is causing the brain to do a kind of compensatory effect on tile B, which suggests that given the presence of that particular shading, then we would expect the B tile to be a different shade than it sort of is in its raw pixelated form. So I guess in the 1920s and 30s, a lot of sort of social psychologists or psychologists in general were really interested in the ways in which the brain is interpreting these pieces of information that surround us. And in the sort of 50s and 60s, they then moved much more into questions around social psychology, and in particular, sort of post-World War II, questions around what drives us as humans and how the social context in which we make decisions really shapes how, which path we take. Of course, sort of post-World War II, there was a lot of interest in how authority and the way that authority plays into the way that we understand morality affects the decisions that we take in our everyday lives. But since the sort of 50s and 60s, a significant more attention has been paid to questions around sort of context, and in particular, the kinds of things that represent these sorts of distractions, but in an everyday setting. So not in a riddle, but in the context of our everyday lives, when we're taking these 9,000 to 10,000 sort of decisions in our everyday lives, what are the things that intrude upon those decisions that may make us take a slightly different choice than we intend to? So I'm going to skip straight to another example, which is much more in the context of hiring. And in particular, I'm going to share with you a sort of experiment that was done in 2016. This particular experiment was done in Germany, but it may be a familiar sort of setup to an experiment that you might have heard of in your everyday lives, which is that a lot of economists and psychologists are increasingly interested in this question of who is seen to be efficacious, who is seen to have talent in a hiring context. And in particular, how are small differences in the ways that candidates present themselves likely to affect the chances that they're going to get a job? So in 2016, a bunch of economists, as I say, in Germany ran this experiment where they took a fictitious candidate and they set up her CV and her resume. In fact, in Germany, you typically have between sort of 20 and 40 pages worth of a candidate application, which includes all of your prior education history and your work history. So they came up with this fictitious candidate for a series of sort of similar jobs, and they sent out this candidate's application. But before they did so, over what was about 6,000 jobs, they randomly allocated different employers to receiving a slightly different application. So for the first third of employers randomly selected, they received an application from this woman, Sandra Bauer, and this was the picture on the front of her application. For another third of employers, they received exactly the same candidate materials, same picture as for Sandra, but this time the name on the application was Miriam Ozturk. And finally, for a final third of employers, they received again exactly the same candidate details, all the same education history, same work history. It was the same woman in the picture, and her name was Miriam Ozturk, but this time she was also wearing a headscarf. So what these economists and psychologists then did is they sat by these phones that they had with different phone numbers, and they waited to see which of these three exactly equal candidates with the same work history, same educational background, and same interests received an invitation to an interview. So the summary of what they found was that Sandra Bauer received a call back for an interview about 20% of the time. So 1 in 5, not too bad. But interestingly, when her name was Miriam and nothing else was different, she only received a call back about 14% of the time. And then I'm sure many of you can anticipate where I'm going with this. When she was also wearing a headscarf, that dropped to just 4% of the time. So what's notable about this particular experiment, which, as I say, has now been replicated in about 40 countries around the world, in lots of different types of settings with different types of jobs, using different photos or different names, what they tend to find is that underrepresented groups are significantly less likely to be selected into an interview, even when they present with exactly the same candidate application. What I thought was interesting about this particular study is that they not only studied the difference in sort of ethnic and racial associations of the name, which is a pretty common way that these experiments are set up, where they take two different names with different kinds of sort of ethnic associations. But here you can also see that they were able to unpack this, what they call intersectional discrimination. So not only the difference between going from a sort of quintessentially German sounding name to a quintessentially Turkish sounding name, but also then adding the headscarf. And you can see that there's a compounding discrimination for Miriam when she's wearing a headscarf. So while we're on the sort of sad part of things, it's possibly worth just reminding ourselves that even though these kinds of studies have been run since about the 1970s all over the world, actually, sadly, not a whole lot is changing. So what I'm sharing with you on the left-hand side of the screen here is a series of similar studies done in the UK between sort of the early to mid 1970s and as recently as a couple of years ago. And you can see they've just taken, for example, the rate of discrimination against Pakistani heritage sounding names. And you can see that a person with a Pakistani heritage sounding name needs to send between 1.5 to 2 times as many CVs to get the same rate of callback for interview. And probably what's notable about that is there's really no trend to see that reducing over time. The equivalent sort of study pulling together, again, multiple studies done in the United States since about the 80s shows a very similar result, which is there's actually no statistically significant reduction in the rate of discrimination against ethnic minorities in hiring processes, as shown by these randomized studies. Now, if you're like me, this particular finding is particularly hard to understand, given that it's not like the world hasn't changed a lot in the last 40 or 50 years. And in fact, I think most of us would feel that social attitudes, workplace practices, and the kind of skills and opportunities of different groups in the economy have changed a lot in the last 40 or 50 years. And it seems kind of crazy to see that actually the rate of discrimination shows no sign of abating. And of course, there are 1,000 reasons why that might be the case, but it is interesting to note that some of the ways that we've been trying to solve for this problem aren't working. So I think many of us in this group have probably at some point done some form of diversity and inclusion or unconscious bias training. In fact, probably if I asked you to all put your hands up, I'd hazard a guess that about sort of 80 to 90% of us have done these types of trainings at some point in our career. Unfortunately, as is shown by this particular graph, which was, again, a meta-analysis of lots of studies looking at the impact of diversity and inclusion training on the rate at which managers of different minority groups were hired into organizations, you can see that actually training, if anything, is associated with a slightly lower rate of hiring women, and in particular, Asian and Black women into organizations. So despite the fact that it's estimated that something in the order of $8 billion is spent by US corporates alone on these kinds of training programs every year, there's actually very little evidence to suggest that any of these training programs are having the intended effect. Now, it's worth stopping and saying, why is that? Because it's hardly the case that the intention isn't right, or that the kinds of training programs, in fact, often which rely on a lot of the same material that I'm sharing with you today, They are well intended and usually designed by people who know a lot about the science behind why we have unconscious bias and the kinds of effects it can have on organizations. In my view, the reason why we're not seeing the effects that we would expect is that we're using the wrong tool. And in particular, what we're kind of doing here is we're using training. It might be 1 hour, 2 hours, even a day's worth of training, with an intention of effectively rewiring the parts of the brain that are set up to do that system one thinking. So a lot of those 9,000 to 14,000 decisions we take in our everyday lives are set up to be super fast and efficient. And in order to be fast and efficient, they rely on heuristics. And those heuristics or shortcuts are framed by thousands of miniaturized experiences that we have in our everyday lives that shape everything from what we understand to be true to the sort of stereotypes of how we see other people. And it's not that training doesn't intend to achieve these kinds of outcomes, but I think we're asking too much of 1 to 2 to 8 hours to sort of effectively rewire the neurology of our brain that is set up in a context in which we see leaders to be a certain kind of person. So what do we do at Applied? How do we think about this kind of challenge at Applied? I guess, as James alluded to at the beginning, my background is in behavioural science, and we sort of spun the company out of the behavioural insights team. So the real core of what we think about doing as behavioural economists is, instead of targeting the kind of system 2 part of the brain, we actually start to think about how do we rewire the environment in which those decisions get taken so that they can be taken in line with our intention, which I'm going to hazard a guess for almost all of us, is that we don't want to be biased in the decisions that we take. And we want to make sure that Miriam Ozturk wearing a headscarf is as likely to get an interview as Sandra Bauer is without one. So one of the first things we started to think about at Applied was a lot of the sort of common things, like thinking about the kind of things that sit in hiring processes and trying to think about what is the context of that decision-making process. So many of you who have been involved in lots of hiring decisions will know that actually it's estimated that as little as sort of 10 seconds is the amount of time that we spend looking at somebody else's CV or resume before we decide whether we want to bring them in to interview. So from a behavioural standpoint, what becomes really fascinating is how fast that decision is being taken, and therefore how much information is being absorbed or not absorbed in those crucial 10 seconds. Now, of course, if we look at the average CV, the kinds of things which tend to stand out at us are, of course, things like the candidate's name or the kinds of organisations they might have worked in, where they went to university, and maybe a couple of other kind of bolded items. Now, as you can see on this particular slide, there's actually quite a lot of stuff in our CVs, which might lead us to overinterpret small signals. We might be more likely to see that they worked in a particular organisation once before. We have a strong positive or negative association with that organisation, and that forms a strong impression in our brains, which we then use inadvertently as a confirmation point. We then seek additional information that confirms that that person is either likely to be a great hire or a poor hire, purely off the basis of that information. So one of the first things we wanted to do at Applied was start to think about this CV and think about the kinds of things that we could do to remove the risk that unnecessary information is sort of forming a part of this crucial 10 seconds of decision making. And the obvious thing that we could do to begin with is just to anonymize them. If knowing that James's name is James, it doesn't tell me anything about whether he's going to be a great managing director of Fresh Minds, I don't really need to know it at all. And in fact, it's possible that I had a great experience or a terrible experience with somebody else called James at some point in my life, and that's going to influence the way I think. Or I have some kind of deep-seated unconscious association with the name James and its ethnic association. Either way, I don't need to see that information to make a decision. And what's interesting is over the last 6 years, how quickly this sort of concept of anonymized or blinded recruitment has become a part of sort of more standard hiring practices. But about 6 years ago, we were the first platform to do anonymized recruitment. And we saw that really as the sort of beginning of a whole host of things that we could do to remove bias from decision-making. Now, it's worth sort of focusing a little bit on why it is that CVs are also problematic in hiring processes. And the large reason why that's the case is not only are they riddled with opportunities for bias, but it turns out they're actually just not that predictive of job performance. So what I'm sharing with you here is a bunch of modeling that we've done on some meta-analyses, pulling together the kinds of things which are predictive of job performance. And what you're essentially seeing here is a series of candidates, and their actual performance is listed on the kind of x-axis here, and their predicted performance is what we see on the y-axis. So ideally, you'd be wanting to pull apart the most highly skilled candidates into your hiring process. But actually what we see in a lot of CV-based sifting processes is we tend to select this group of candidates. What we actually are looking for is the kind of candidates in this upper right quadrant. But you can see here that in actual fact, most of the time, we're only selecting about 1 in 10 of the most highly qualified candidates into our hiring processes. And at the same time, we're missing out on a series of candidates that are very skilled, but may have a slightly different profile than we're expecting for that particular role. So what we're actually aiming to do is de-link our hiring processes away from the things which are not very predictive, which tend to be CVs, and attach them instead to the kinds of things which are more likely to identify high performers in the role. So how do we do that? The way that we think about doing that is by really unpacking the hiring process from start to finish. So I said earlier that CVs are not that predictive of job performance, but that's a pretty incendiary remark for a lot of people who've been relying, as we all have, for about 100 years on these kinds of artifacts. So what I'm sharing with you here is this meta-analysis that's been done looking at different things that we test candidates on and how likely it is that they predict on the job performance. So the reason why we identify CVs as not very predictive, and that's where a lot of the research lies, is actually that they rely on these kinds of things like years of education, years of experience, reference checks, which actually have very low correlations with on-the-job performance. Instead, however, if we were to focus on testing candidates actually on the things they're going to do in the day job through what we refer to as work sample tests, but a lot of other people call, job sample tests and so forth, it's actually got a much higher chance that you're going to be finding someone who's very skilled for that particular job. And in many respects, that's kind of intuitive. The more that you test someone on the thing they're actually going to do, the more likely it is that you'll identify someone who's good at that thing, and be much less likely to be relying on proxies of performance, which have a very high level of noise associated with them. So what we think about doing is reworking the hiring process, which typically looks like a CV sift with some not very predictive tools, perhaps followed by an unstructured interview, which again tends to be sort of middling in its predictivity. Often you then get to a structured interview or a panel interview, which can be quite predictive of job performance. But by that point, you've lost a lot of your really excellent candidates, particularly the ones that have non-standard work backgrounds. You then usually move to a sort of meet the boss style unstructured interview, which again is not that predictive, and then sort of finish up with a reference check, which is even less predictive. Now, in our view, you should be replacing that process with something which is predictive the whole way along the game. And so from our perspective, that means starting out potentially with multiple choice tests, but that focus on their cognitive abilities, then moving to work sample tests, then moving to structured interviews, and then finally finishing up with a final structured interview, which tests something that you haven't yet tested. But importantly, all of the kinds of things that you want to be getting out of a candidate is pre-specified, and you treat each candidate the same way throughout that process. So I return again to this mission statement, because what I want to do now is share with you the kind of main topic of what we wanted to talk about. We've talked now about how we kind of restructuring hiring processes around getting more quality out of your kind of sifting and selection processes, which ultimately drives more efficiency, because the more likely it is that you, the more that you choose candidates that are sort of predictive of being very strongly correlated with being high performers in the job, the more likely it is that you're only spending your interviewing time and those sort of precious hours toward the end of a hiring process on the real candidates who have a great shot at being sort of great hires for your organization. But the structure of today's conversation is also about how do we simultaneously solve for diversity? And of course, the original mandate of the behavioral science sort of beginnings of our platform was this sort of question around how do we make sure that in hiring processes, we're selecting Miriam Ozturk with a headscarf as often as we are selecting Sandra Bauer. So what I wanted to share with you is actually some data that I pulled together in about June of last year, which was specifically looking at the ways in which STEM-based organizations or organizations which are trying to hire into STEM-based roles can benefit from a kind of rethought hiring process, and in particular, one that focuses on selecting candidates with a high chance of being great at the job and not at people who look perhaps the part that you were expecting. So over the course of the last 6 years, we've had about 350,000 candidates come through our hiring process. And so we've had a lot of opportunity to learn what works. And when we first started with Applied, we actually ran a very large randomized control trial, which found that over half of the candidates selected through our sort of debiased hiring process wouldn't otherwise have gotten the job, and that they were statistically more likely to come from diverse groups. In particular, we saw evidence that we were selecting more candidates from a wider array of educational backgrounds. So also came not only with different levels of education, but from a wider array of educational institutions. We saw evidence that we were selecting candidates from a different set of kind of work backgrounds, and also evidence that we were selecting in more candidates from ethnic and racial minorities, as well as disability. And depending on the kind of organisation, we also saw evidence around gender. But of course, over the course of the last year, there's been even more attention, and I would believe rightly so, over the huge and dawning and continuing gap on racial and ethnic diversity, and in particular, the impact that this is having on STEM-based organisations. So what I thought to do was actually to pull together a bunch of the data we have from our existing organisations using Applied in this sort of debiased way, and have a look at how they're doing at selecting a more diverse set of candidates on racial and ethnic grounds. So what I did is I pulled together a bunch of organisations in the UK in 3 broad groups. So I looked at our organisation, the organisations in our sort of ecosystem that I would call kind of core STEM. So those are those who are sort of science, tech, engineering, mathematics, and medicine. I then also pulled together those who work in sort of finance. So we've got a bunch of VCs, private equity firms, those involved in sort of financial management and regulation, because of course there's quite a strong overlap and a growing overlap in the kinds of skill sets that these organisations are looking for. And then finally, I also pulled in the kinds of organisations that are in kind of research and technical consulting. So this is not only the sort of strategy and management consultants using Applied, but also the sort of think tanks and research-based organisations. Again, because there was quite a strong overlap in the kinds of skill sets that they were looking for. So in this particular study, I've pulled sort of data from about 50 clients for hundreds of roles and covering about 40,000 candidates that came through our platform. So what I was looking to do was to test how well were we doing at kind of moving the needle on diversity for these kinds of roles. And in order to do that, I first needed to get a sense of what the baseline is. So there's a bunch of different ways you can start to think about sort of a STEM baseline in the economy, but in particular, one of the things you could do is, and I did this, have a bit of a look at like the UK employed population. But, you know, of course, that covers a huge array of people. I then also looked at kind of what's the scientific workforce that includes the health sector, and also the scientific workforce excluding the health sector, because of course that drives quite a lot of the results. So if you pull sort of UK-wide data on these, you can see that our kind of the rate at which ethnic and minority candidates, so kind of what is sometimes referred to as BAME, candidates in these kinds of roles is pretty low. So something just over around about 10% of those workforces come from ethnic minority backgrounds. Now, of course, we can then break that out and start to see that even within those ethnic minority backgrounds, there's quite a lot of diversity. So a significantly higher proportion of those workforces are made up by candidates from Asian backgrounds, certainly much more than Black, mixed, or others. So looking at these kinds of data points at least gave us a sense of what are we trying to compete against? Like, what is the current world of these sort of workforces look like? And how are we doing at comparing against that by rechanging what our kind of hiring process looks like? And so what I'm sharing with you now is the sort of results of that particular study. And you can see that overall, so looking on the right-hand side here, we saw a significant uplift in the rate at which BAME candidates were hired into these jobs. So something between sort of 26 and 38% of all the hires that came through in this particular subset came from a minority ethnic background. But what you can also see here is there are two other things that are relevant. One is, of course, we also saw different uplifts for different minority groups. And that left us with a very open challenge, which hopefully we can get into in the conversation, around the interesting feature that even in a debiased process, we're seeing certain groups do even better than others. What's also relevant here is the sort of differences across these three sort of subsets of sectors that I pulled out. So the first is sort of the impact on core STEM, then on financial services and on consulting. And you can see slightly different impacts for different groups, for different kinds of organizations. Now, there's obviously lots of different ways we could read that kind of data, but the kind of leading thing that kind of comes to me when I've sort of unpacked a lot of this is the kind of scale of the uplift tends to represent the scale of the challenge in that type of organization. So in particular, we see that the financial sector organizations had a long way to go, and actually debiasing their processes had this significantly large uplift, in particular around some very underrepresented groups in those particular organizations. So we went from having sort of around about 10% of candidates in the existing workforce coming from these groups to something in the order of a third or even more of the hires through our platform came from those particular groups. Or another way of thinking about that level of impact is that sort of debiased process resulted in teams hiring between about 2.5 and 3.5 times as many candidates from underrepresented ethnic groups, which is something that we're obviously incredibly proud of. But as I alluded to earlier, these impacts are not linear, and we're still seeing that there are some groups where we've got room to improve. So hopefully we can get into a little bit of that discussion at the end here. I think what's also relevant to sort of add in here is what the candidate's perspective on this whole space looks like, because naturally going through a debiased hiring process, particularly one that, as our process does, actually takes away the CV and presents candidates with work sample-based questions that are then evaluated anonymously. It's quite different for candidates to go through as much as it is for organizations. So what I thought I'd share with you is actually a very recent LinkedIn post from a woman who now works at one of the organizations that we are very lucky to work with, Future Super. So they're a pension fund here in Australia. And she was hired through Applied and now actually runs all of their people-related processes. But as is shown in this sort of testimonial, it's not like the first experience is as normal. It is a strange and different experience for candidates. But as you can see here, the kind of results that she's been able to see in her own organisation in terms of the uplift for women and people of colour is so high that she's become, you know, a real advocate of using Applied in her own organisation. So not only was she seeing the sort of strong impact on herself as a woman of colour, but she's also started to see those impacts being spread across her organisation that she's now joined. So in addition to that particular study, which of course is now up on our website, we're very passionate about sharing the results of all of our work. I thought I'd also share with you a couple of the other pieces of evidence that we found along the last 6 years about things that we're seeing work within organisations that we work with, which now number something in the order of 250 to 300 organisations worldwide. So for those of you who are struggling to hire women into tech jobs, we've seen that about 45% of all the tech hires in the UK have gone to women or non-binary candidates. As I said earlier, we've got about a 2 to 4 times uplift in the rate of selection of ethnically diverse candidates. We get very strong candidate feedback as well, and we've seen significant uplifts in the kind of rate at which candidates who are brought through to interview are ultimately offered a job, which again comes back to this efficiency point. The more that you're selecting candidates that are most likely to be high performers for that organisation, the more likely it is you're using your time in a hiring process wisely. And one final thing I thought I'd leave with you is actually around retention. Something we've always felt very passionately about is making sure that we're not only caring about bringing a more diverse set of candidates into the pipeline, but that they're also staying and thriving in the organisations that they join. And we're happy to say that we get over 95% of candidates still in the job 1 year on, which is something that's, you know, really important to us, and obviously a significant uplift on the sort of 80 to 82% average benchmark for first year retention. So if you're interested to learn a little bit more about the kinds of organisations we work with, we're very happy to share a little bit more about that. But here's just a sort of smattering of some of the people we're very lucky to partner with, including Fresh Minds. And hopefully we'll spend a little bit of time now with Q&A. Back to you, James. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Fascinating talk, and some really great evidence of the fantastic impact Applied has been making on those searches in the last couple of years. So just to add to our audience, now is a sort of discussion time, really very relaxed. But if you could maybe, if you have a burning question or anything that Kate's spoken about, or maybe just an issue that your firm is experiencing that could improve upon, or a learning that's something positive that you managed to change, then please just drop it into the chat box below, and we will try our very best to sort of tackle those questions as they come through. I've got a couple of quick questions I might just quickly ask upon. The first one for me is around certainly within the consulting world and maybe the investment world. One of the challenges that we as headhunters and no doubt our competitors have as well is that our clients are actually asking for people from specific companies, be it an audit firm, be a consulting firm, or a Bain or a McKinsey or whatever else, and therefore one is challenged by kind of propagating the failure of the graduate recruitment processes 5 or 10 years previously. And I think clearly the skills-based sample questions that one can ask in through the Applied platform is fantastic, particularly for kind of early and entry level roles. What's been your thinking around more experienced hires, and this is the bias that people have of, oh, I'll hire her because she was at Google and Google's done really well, kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a great question, James, and lots packed in there. So I guess sort of two big things, I guess, that come to mind. First of all, I guess this idea that we have a tendency, and I say we because I'm part of this sort of challenge as well. We have a tendency to sort of lean on other people's decision making in order to make our own. So the kind of classic thing is like, well, they worked at Google, they must be brilliant. Google's really hard to get into, and therefore that's a sort of automatic yes, which has a lot of logic to it. But of course, there's also ways in which that can fall down. Now, the first way in which that can fall down is if Google's own hiring process led to them finding lots of high quality candidates, but not necessarily from diverse backgrounds, then you're essentially inheriting the existing biases of those prior organizations by leaning too heavily on their own selection processes. The second kind of obvious thing, of course, is that Google may not be that similar to your own organization, and the most likely thing that will determine whether someone's going to succeed in your organization with the challenges and opportunities that you have is by tailoring your hiring process around the very thing you're going to ask them to do, not what they've been asked to do in the past. And of course, a lot of that comes back to the fact that people learn skills in lots of different places these days, and no more so in tech. Tech is one of these interesting parts of the economy where you really wouldn't look at where someone went to undergrad 10 years ago to know whether or not they're going to be a great hire into a tech company, because technology changes so quickly that what you're actually most interested in is what are the new languages they've been learning in the last 6 to 18 months, because that's going to tell you more about whether or not they're on top of the technologies that you need to be successful. So that's what I'd say about the sort of first challenge, which is this tendency to sort of lean on sort of prior experience in, I would say, in an excessive sense. The second one, I guess, James, that you alluded to is, how does it feel for senior people to be hired through a process like Applied? And I guess I would just say, that was naturally one of the things people were quite worried about in the early days. It feels quite unusual for people to be kind of involved in a hiring process that's quite different. I think a lot of people, particularly in senior roles, are used to being sort of effectively wined and dined through hiring processes, and the idea of being totally anonymized as you're being evaluated on your capacity to bring a skill to the job feels unusual. I would just say that tends not to hold true when you actually test people on it. And in fact, for a lot of senior people, it's actually kind of refreshing to realize that there's an opportunity to be seen in a slightly different way. Not that you can take anything from any singular experience, but our own investor, Blackbird, uses our platform to hire for themselves. They've recently hired someone in as a strategic advisor who's the chair of the Tesla board, and she went through Applied to get that job. So if the chair of Tesla is open to it, I think we can probably beat down a few more of these misconceptions and myths. about the kind of willingness of senior people to go through different processes. I think probably what's worth sort of reiterating though is there's no value in putting people through a process they're not used to if they don't understand why. And it's always been hugely important to us at Applied that the candidate experience is as clear about the rationale and the way in which they're going to be treated. And we try and do the most we possibly can to offer a transparent experience of the hiring process. Now, for people who are going into roles where feedback is hugely important, one of the things we've built in, and we work quite closely, I know, getting feedback from you, James, and the team, is actually having standardized but personalized recruitment. So, feedback for every candidate that comes through the platform. So they know when they go through a hiring process, they are definitely going to get something out in return. And that's a really important part of the reciprocal bond we create with candidates, but also that they're kind of given a window into what the hiring process looks like and why it looks different. And for a lot of candidates, in particular, those who come from underrepresented groups, we just get a litany of sort of testimonials from people saying, I wouldn't otherwise have applied were it not that I knew the process was going to be de-biased. I'm tired of being overlooked for jobs that I know I'm capable of hiring into. So I know one of the questions I think from Lena was, how do you attract a more diverse group of people to apply in the first place? And I guess there are two things I might say to that, James, if you don't mind me quickly answering that question.
That was my next question.
Is I guess several things we do there, Lena. One is actually just the hiring process itself tends to result in a much higher proportion of diverse candidates applying because it's so upfront why it is they're going through this process, and that actually draws in more candidates. We've got quite a lot of evidence to suggest that we attract 2 to 4 times as many diverse candidates as you might expect to come through, and we think some of that is just about the sheer signalling. The other way in which we try and attract a more diverse group of candidates, and if you'll bear with me while I really quickly share my screen with you again, is actually sort of the parts of the process which we didn't really talk through. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
Again? So I'm sharing with you now what I hadn't had a chance to share with you earlier, which is that we also have a part of our platform which takes a job description and automatically scores it against 2 different metrics. I'm just checking you can actually see the screen with my with the kind of job description analysis tool, James, or are you seeing my...
Yeah, all clear. Yes, it's there.
Yep, great. So you can see there that we've got an inclusion score that is generated as well as a conversion score, which is essentially like how many candidates do we think would convert with a job description written in this way. So there's a bunch of things that we have baked into the platform on the kind of front end on the attraction side to try and make sure that you're not hampering yourself from, from getting a more diverse set of candidates in the door at the sort of first hurdle, which is really at the attraction end. If we get time later on, or if you want to have a little bit more information about that, Lena or anybody else, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll happily demo that part of the platform for you as well.
Brilliant. Then a question from Ian Jones. Hello, Ian. Nice to see you. Great overview by Kate. I didn't quite understand the initial candidate sift in the absence of a CV being reviewed. How do you screen ahead of the initial testing, as it were?
Great question, Ian, and I apologise. I sort of erred a little bit too much perhaps on sharing the research with you and not on sharing exactly how the applied process works. So James, can you bear with me if I share again and do a really quick slide that sort of walks through the process of an applied sift?
Of course. I'm very impressed with your on-demand PowerPoint skills. That's
Thank you. Hopefully, can you see that screen now, James?
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm sharing with you here, Ian, and everyone, is kind of what an alternative process looks like. And this is kind of effectively what we do at Applied. So if you think about a traditional hiring process, it usually has, let's say, 3 different candidates apply with their CVs. As I alluded to earlier, we don't believe, and in fact, it's not a point of belief, the evidence suggests they're not that predictive of job performance, and they're also riddled with opportunities for bias. So actually, the very first thing we do is we ditch the CV. Now, you can, I should say, collect a CV. It just won't be the main thing that you make a candidate decision on. The main thing you're going to be making a candidate decision on is candidates' responses to these work sample questions. So usually 3 to 5 questions that they answer in 250 words. each, which is sort of about, collectively becomes about the size of a custom cover letter. So they answer these sort of questions which reflect what the job is really about. So if you were going into a consulting organization, that might be a mixture of the kind of analytical skills you're looking for. So you give them a short prelude on a kind of customer problem and ask them to give their kind of analysis of it. You might also get them to tell you a bit about how they would deal with a tricky client issue. So give them a scenario about a particular challenge they're having in a client project and how they would handle it. You might also give them a question about how they manage their time and prioritize. So let's say you gave them these 3 questions, they then responded. So you've got answers to these quick questions from all of your candidates. Then once the candidates have submitted, that's when all of the kind of interesting behavioral science happens. The first thing we do, as I mentioned earlier, is we anonymize all the candidate applications. So you don't know whether it's Charlie or Ian or Lena or Will or James or anybody. All you see as a reviewer is these answers to questions. But instead of giving them to you in a kind of 1, 2, 3, and then the next candidate 1, 2, 3, which we think runs the risk of a whole bunch of biases around maybe you love their first response, and so therefore you're going to be kinder to unconsciously on your evaluations of them thereafter. Or we've done a bunch of studies that show that you make different decisions in the afternoon than you might make about exactly the same candidates in the morning, whether you've had a great meeting or a poor meeting, whether you're tired, whether you've had your coffee. All of those contextual factors influence the scores that you give. And so we mitigate against those additional biases by doing a few things. The first thing we do is we actually chunk up candidate responses by question, not by candidate. So you effectively do a horizontal evaluation of candidates on particular skill areas. The reason why we do that is it's significantly faster in the brain to do a direct comparison of candidates on the same dimension at once, because you can very readily see who's got the skill that you're looking for. It also means that your evaluation of a candidate on the analytical question won't influence the way that you score them on the client question, which may be very different. They may be very strong in one and poorer in the other. And we want to unearth those differences because it's actually about knowing the unique skills and strengths of those candidates that will help you identify who's going to be best. So as I mentioned, first is anonymizing, then we chunk up horizontally. The third thing we do is we then randomize the order that each of these candidates appear, which seems a little bit like behavioral science gone mad. But the reason we do that is because, as I mentioned earlier, we've got all of this evidence that suggests that you're going to make a different decision in the afternoon than you made in the morning with the same information. And we tended to find that people start off more generously and they become much harsher with candidates throughout an evaluative process. So for any of you who has a surname in the latter part of the alphabet, it's very likely that you tend to sit at the back of most hiring processes when you apply. And that means statistically, based on all of the evidence we have, which where again, this is all publicly available if you want to have a look, statistically, you're much more likely to be meeting reviewers when they're feeling harsher. And so you're less likely to just get an interview purely on the basis of being seen toward the end. So finally, we then allow multiple people to score these candidates without seeing each other's scores. So we can account for groupthink. So we don't let James's evaluation of a candidate or Charlie's evaluation of a candidate influence Patrick's evaluation of a candidate. We then pull all of that together and in the back end, and that allows us to then identify which candidates are the best to bring through to the next round of the process, which we then support with a structured interviewing module that allows you to go all the way through to the point of hire. And as you might imagine, we're pretty obsessed with doing a lot of analytics that sit behind. So this is actually a picture from within the platform itself. You can see lots of data points come together to identify who's likely to be best for the job. And then that allows us to do a whole host of things like provide feedback to candidates, evaluate the quality of all of your questions, and do a ton of sort of additional sort of diversity analytics as well. Sorry, my screen's a bit slow here. Doing a bunch of diversity analytics and a whole host of other things in the background. Sorry, that was a rather long explanation, but hopefully, Ian, that answers your question.
Thank you. Couple of quick, maybe fast ones. One from Will, actually. Hi, Will. Around, he just mentioned his pilots for UK government, and they obviously try to interview a very structured and fair way, but people therefore also game that way, i.e. they kind of coach because they know the questions that might be asked and maybe the answers that might be desired. What's your thinking on structured interviewing in that regard?
Great question, Will. So you're right that it can feel a bit stilted. I think most people feel like there's sort of a risk of sort of an automated process or sort of robotic-based process. And in fact, one of the things that we've built into our platform is a little bit of a text at the beginning of a structured interview of what you should be telling the candidate, which includes explaining why you use a structured interviewing process and the ways in which you're going to be collecting data that helps you to make a great decision, but that you don't want it to feel too rigid. And actually just even explaining to candidates why that's the case and not just hitting them up front with something that feels very like a sort of pro forma experience is quite important just for sort of candidate experience. I think to your point, Will, around this sort of idea of being able to game those kinds of systems, I think a lot of that comes back to actually whether or not you're using truly work sample-based questions or you're using the sort of traditional competency-based questions, the sort of ones which lend themselves to those sort of traditional star-based response. Here was the situation, here was my task, here was my action, here was the result. Now, those kinds of ones we do know are highly correlated with selecting people from very particular socioeconomic and socioeducational backgrounds, because those sorts of organisations and institutions tend to teach you how to respond well to those questions. So you'll have an inbuilt bias actually sometimes with using competency-based questions. Instead, if you use questions which are genuinely structured around, here is a challenge you might face in the job, walk me through the thinking that you would do, it allows two things to happen. One is it's much more predictive, and two, it allows for more free-form discussion. And what you're really evaluating candidates there on is not their ability to get the right answer. What you're looking for is the ways that they think through problems. And that allows you to then ask those sort of follow-up probing questions around, okay, let me complicate. Let's imagine that worked really well, but then with this other organization, it didn't work well in these ways. How would you change your approach? And it's really in the kind of ability to use follow-up questions that brings those kinds of otherwise seemingly kind of rigid processes a bit more to life and make them a lot more about actually getting to the bottom of the skill sets of the people in the room. I don't know, Will, whether that fully answers your question. I think you've got a lot packed in there, but I'm very happy to sort of take that offline if you think there's more we can sort of talk to there.
Great. We've got a couple of minutes. We have to let you go to bed at some point, Kate. But one other one for us, I suppose, and it kind of builds on what Lena was saying around, like any recruitment process ultimately is a pipeline from people applying and being attracted to a company or a role in the first place, right down to who gets the job at the end. And a couple of things from that. One is some companies just have quite unattractive, working lives, and which might therefore just naturally bias against parents or people with young children. Or so let's say you're a partner in a law firm, but you don't really want to work 12 or 14 hours a day. Maybe will have changed through the pandemic, and people can see that you can chunk up time and work in asynchronous fashion. But what's been your advice to clients like that, whereby they aren't attracting the groups they want to attract because of the kind of what they actually are?
Well, that's probably two ways I might answer that one, James. The first is, you've already said it yourself. I think the past year has obviously brought significant devastation in lots of different aspects of people's lives. But there is possibly one upside, which is that it's really caused us to challenge a lot of the assumptions about what is and isn't possible in organisations. I mean, if you think about the decades we've spent talking about flexible working arrangements and remote working arrangements, and everyone said it's too hard, it's too hard, it's too hard. And then you just force it upon people, and it turns out people are remarkably adaptable. I mean, you and I are on this call with a fabulous group of people, possibly mostly in the UK, but I'm in Australia. We're all doing this not in person in times when we might have once said this is not something any of us would have ever sort of signed up for or thought was a sort of the best use of our 1 and a bit hours, right? So I think one is actually we can challenge a lot of those assumptions about how the workplace operates. And I think you alluded to that earlier. I do think there's a lot more work to be done to kind of get underneath this working hours challenge. And of course, there's some interesting work being done by law firms and consulting firms worldwide to sort of think about how they resource themselves slightly differently to account for the just realities of that. The second thing I would say, though, is I think we need to really ask ourselves whether or not the assumptions we're making about work are true. So in a world where men, even if we live in a sort of gender binary world where typically fathers were the ones working and typically mothers were the ones at home, that of course is shifting quite quickly. And so we need to change our workplaces for fathers as much as we do to accommodate more women into those workplaces. And I'm really optimistic that I think if we can start to think about the changes we make to organizations, not only to kind of bring new groups in that are underrepresented, but that will have benefits across all people in those given organizations, make it easier for fathers to be a bigger part of their children's lives by actually allowing flexible working arrangements, will not only boost the number of potentially working mothers who feel that certain jobs are capable and open to them, but it will also have this sort of flow-on effect to men and other non-binary people in the organisation as well. I know that might seem like a weasel response, because there are organisations that still just have brutally long hours, but I'm increasingly of the view that the kind of differences between genders and other types of sort of demographic groups are narrowing in terms of what people want. I think men as much as women and non-binary groups want to have work in a kind of healthy balance with the rest of their lives. And that's the thing that we should be tackling.
Great. We've hit a very optimistic end to your talk, Kate. Thank you so much. So first of all, big thank you to all our audience out there for turning up, be it live or later on today, or it's near time. Thank you for that. And a huge thank you to Kate for staying up late, number one. But number two, getting your brilliant business applied off the ground and being as successful as it is. And third, just the fantastic impact you genuinely have made in our thinking and in your clients' thinking, and changing the way that our system 2 brains, or one brains, think about having more diverse and inclusive businesses. So really well done. Thank you so much. We do have our next webinar is in a couple of weeks' time. It's on Thursday, the 13th of May, in 3 p.m. UK time. And that's with Dr. Melissa Barrett, who is former MD at Accenture, was head of ESG there. So environment, sustainability and governance. She worked loads with the World Economic Forum on the future of the consumer goods industry, and is going to share some of her thinking there. So if you're keen and interested in that area, and that's a big area for your company, then please do sign up for that. But thank you all very much. Have a lovely rest of the day, and thanks again, Kate. Bye-bye.
Thanks, James. Thanks, everyone.